So it's my job to introduce Eric Zorn, and I've known Eric for, well, I looked at his bio, and it's about 35 years or so, because I worked at the Tribune at the time that Eric joined the Tribune in 1980. He was initially in what they call the suburban Trib, and then eventually he moved downtown and was given this column, which he has had now for 29 years. He's been writing a column for the Tribune. And I remind him or I asked him about that this morning, and he said, "Oh, surely not. It hasn't been 29 years." But then when we counted up the years, that's what it's been. So he and Eric and I are pretty much in agreement on most political issues, but there's one issue that I have a disagreement with him, and that is a column that he wrote last week in which he said he likes Spirit Airlines. So, Eric, I don't know whether you're going to talk about that today, but you might get tossed out of the room if you say it too loudly. But at any rate, here's Eric Zorn.
Thanks, Ed. Ed was one of the most respected members of the Tribune when he was there, and it's an honor to be introduced by him. His wife Ellen was the lactation consultant for my oldest son, and the breastfeeding took, and the advantages of it, I guess, are apparent because he's now in his third year in grad school in math. So it worked. Thank you, Ellen, for that. I'd like to thank the Society for inviting me back. I've been speaking here off and on since the 90s, back when you had that other little room over there where you had, any of you here, how many of you were here when you had the two rooms? And not very many, but, ooh, sorry about that. And some of you may remember from my previous talks that I'm one of your co-religionists, as it were. If I were someone who joined things, this is the kind of society that I would join. Convention dictates that I start with a joke. So I thought I'd tell you one that I've been telling a lot lately. It seems there are a group of 4 men who meet back in their hometown every 10 years. They play a round of golf and catch up. And then they go out to lunch. When they were 40, after the round, they discussed where they would go for lunch, and finally they agreed to go to Hooters, because the waitresses are young and good-looking, showed lots of cleavage, and wore short shorts. 10 years later, at age 50, once again they met to play, and once again they discussed where they should go for lunch. Finally, they agreed to go to Hooters, because the food and service is good, and they had a lot of televisions to watch the games, and the beer selection is excellent. 10 years later, at age 60, they once again meet to play, and once again they discuss where they should go for lunch, and finally, they agreed to go to Hooters because there's plenty of parking and there are low-sodium options on the menu. 10 years later, at age 70, once again they met to play. Once again, they discussed where they should go for lunch. And finally, they agreed to go to Hooters because prices are good, the restrooms have sturdy grip bars in the stalls, and the background music isn't too loud. 10 years later, at age 80, they once again met to play golf. And once again, they discussed where they should go for lunch. And finally, they agreed to go to Hooters because they've never been there before. I'm afraid this may be the only thing I have to say that will bring a smile to your face today. Chicago and the state of Illinois are in as bad a shape economically as I've seen them in what Ed says is 29 years at the Tribune, writing a column. I'm not sure that could possibly be right, but I'll ask my math-minded son. I don't see either the city or the state being led by people with the political courage and the good judgment to get us back on track. Alan Kimmel and I decided in February that the title of this talk should be Emanuel and Rauner, What Now for Illinois? It was Emanuel or Garcia at the time, but Emanuel and Rauner, What Now for Illinois? And before I try to answer this what now question, I'd like to look at the what the hell happened question. How did we get into this fix? We have multi-billion-dollar budget holes in Springfield, crushing, nearly paralyzing public pension debts in the city and for city schools, as well as on the state level. We have seemingly a fresh news story every day about some vital program that's being eliminated or vastly curtailed. I say there's one word answer to that is cowardice. Generations of politicians from both parties, mostly Democrats, I have to say, but plenty of Republicans as well, who were afraid to ask their constituents, the voters, to pay for government services, programs, and benefits in real time. Rather than raise taxes or cut spending for pay-as-you-go government, our elected officials borrowed and deferred and otherwise wheeled and dealed to push off today's debts onto succeeding generations. Here's one way it happens. Contract time with a public employee union. Teachers say, ask me, SEIU. They want a big pay raise. The politicians who are currying their favor and don't want to see strikes say, well, we can't afford that now with tax hikes or cuts. The voters will hate that. So how about, in lieu of a big raise, we'll sweeten your pension deal? We'll pay you more in 25 years. We'll be retired too. Won't have to answer the question, where is the money with which we are supposed to pay you? Sweet. And by, the actuaries, those killjoys, come in and say to the state or the city or the school board, hey, you know, in order to meet the obligations you've made, you're going to have to invest X into the pension fund this year. And the politicians say, well, we also can't afford that without a tax hike or service cuts that the voters will hate. So how about, in lieu of a proper investment, we'll borrow the money to put into the pension fund? Or we just won't pay it this year in hopes that investment returns will make up the difference. The term we always use for this is kicking the can down the road. Retrospectively, of course, we're indignant about this brazenly irresponsible behavior, those bums, those rascals. At the time, however, most voters have been cool with it. Either cool with it or ignorant about what's really going on. Now, 20 years ago, the liberal pundit Michael Kinsley titled his collection of columns, Big Babies, based on his view of American voters. He wrote this: they make flagrantly incompatible demands. Cut my taxes, preserve my benefits, balance the budget. Then they explode in self-righteous outrage when the politicians fail to deliver. Their attention wanders from issue to issue, with duration of interest seemingly in inverse relationship to its intensity. They are, in short, big babies. Now, I don't think of this as a liberal or conservative critique so much as it is an anthropological critique. People want what they can't afford, and they reward those who promise the impossible. It's always been true. You can have better schools, safer streets, healthier children, and expanding opportunities, and you won't have to pay more in taxes because these things can just happen, trust me. So how did Chicago end up with Rahm Emanuel? Mayor Richard M. Daley finally found himself in a gruesome financial cul-de-sac. He'd sold off city assets, the Skyway, the parking meter concession, and he cut generous deals with labor unions in anticipation of getting the 2016 Olympic Games. The good times were over in 2011, though. And those years from 2011 to 2014 were not going to be fun. So I believe one major reason he stepped aside in favor of this hard-charging, well-connected technocrat who seems to have sworn an oath never to criticize him by name is that he didn't think it was going to be much fun to be the mayor of Chicago anymore. Rahm Emanuel made some tough decisions. He closed 50 public schools. That wasn't popular. No one likes to hear that we can't afford the luxury of staffing and heating half-filled old schools built for a time when Chicago's population was about 25% greater than it is today. He added red light and speed cameras. He imposed a new cell phone tax. He hiked water rates, you name it. All in an effort to be able to brag when it came time for re-election that he hasn't raised property taxes, which is one of the wimpy decisions that he's made because property taxes in Chicago actually are rather low. A report last June from Cook County Clerk David Orr noted that Chicago had the lowest composite property tax rate in Cook County in 2013. A conclusion that was very much in line with a Civic Federation analysis of 2012 data that studied a variety of Cook County communities and concluded that, quote, Chicago had the lowest effective tax rate for residential and industrial properties. Illinois Department of Revenue spreadsheet listing the aggregate 2013 property tax rates in the entire state. And the county seats and towns with populations greater than 10,000 show Chicago ranks 265th lowest out of 276 towns for property tax rates. Washington, D.C. Office of Revenue Analysis, released last November, included a ranking of the 2013 residential property tax rates in the largest city in every state, plus the district. Chicago was 47th. Only Las Vegas, Honolulu, Boise, and Birmingham had lower rates. Still, Emanuel's poll numbers weren't great heading into the recent election season. He's not a hail fellow well met. He's icy, studied, haughty, peremptory. The air he projects is of one for whom listening is painful. But what was great was the size of his campaign war chest. Emanuel made his bones as a fundraiser, started out working for Daley, in part because he's such a forceful, confident personality. And he amassed many millions of dollars before any prospective opponents could begin looking for a path to victory. And you know what happened. None of the progressive aldermen dared to take a shot. Money isn't everything in politics, but it's very important. You have to have your own power base, like Cook County Board President Tony Preckwinkle, or a substantial built-in constituency and great name recognition like Chicago Teachers Union President Karen Lewis. You have to have those things to have a prayer running against a powerful incumbent like Rahm Emanuel. Preckwinkle passed on the opportunity. I'm not sure why. It was not to wait her turn, though. I'm pretty sure about that. She'll be 69 years old next month. That's the age Daley was when he quit. And it wasn't because people weren't begging her to run. Progressives seem to think she is really one of them, though I note that her fondness for establishment candidates, such as the king of nepotism, Cook County Assessor Joe Barrios, comes up again and again. It might have been, as crazy as this sounds, that she likes her current job and doesn't want to be mayor of Chicago. Chicago Teachers Union President Karen Lewis got sick, of course, brain cancer. Many people have confidently told me that she would have clobbered Emanuel if she'd stayed healthy. I'm not so sure. She's an acquired taste. She's every bit as brash as Emanuel and probably even smarter, but she doesn't have the breadth of experience outside the field of education. Cook County Commissioner Chuy Garcia was the third choice in the Anybody But Rahm coalition, and he never quite got his footing either financially or policy-wise. The rap on Garcia, and I offered it myself more than once in my column, was that he didn't have a plan to deal with the financial problems that are facing Chicago. He didn't bring a vision to the campaign. He brought a series of gripes, the main one being that he needed more detail about where all the money goes before he could come up with solutions to the obligations that are hanging over the city. About the CPS budget gap, he said in one debate, "I can't tell you right now how I would solve it, but I'm going to be collaborative and engaging." How would he make up for the estimated $70 million in lost revenue if he were able to follow through on one of his more concrete proposals and end the red light camera program? That is part of the challenge, he said. Now, what looked like fecklessness was actually a combination of fear that the voters would reject him if he told them that tax hikes, probably big ones, are the way to get clear of this mess, and honesty, his refusal to lie to voters that he knew another way out. And Emanuel did not make that mistake. The fiscal plan that he came up with to avoid massive property tax hike, he touted this, it was so filled with doomed proposals and unlikely scenarios that fantasy is the kindest description I can come up with to describe it. It included reductions to pensions that are likely to be declared unconstitutional by the Illinois Supreme Court. It also included a city-owned casino for Chicago, a proposal that has been a bipartisan non-starter in the General Assembly for at least 30 years. It relied on state lawmakers to agree to correct the imbalance that requires Chicago taxpayers to help fund both city and state teacher pensions, while suburban and downstate taxpayers only have to pay for state teacher pensions. It's a fair idea, but downstate lawmakers have a firm lid on it. They know it's going to cost them lots of money if they were ever to agree with it. Rahm Emanuel's plan also relied on the expansion of the sales tax base to include numerous services. We have our economy is increasingly a service economy, and our sales taxes are based on goods. So many states, almost every state, has a broader sales tax base than Illinois does. And this was an idea that Emanuel floated 4 years ago in his first run for mayor, and then he backed away from it, and he then just produced it again during the campaign. And even by his estimates, that was only a $300 million a year take for the city. His plan to cover most of the $1.1 billion deficit being faced by the public schools for the fiscal year beginning in July is, get this, to wring about $700 million in concessions from the state of Illinois. We will pause now for howls of derisive laughter. We're going to talk about the state in just a minute, but the state's pockets are turned inside out. It's cutting programs for sick kids. Still, popular shorthand was that Rahm had a plan and Chewy didn't. I didn't buy that, but voters bought it. Voters also apparently thought that Winnetka businessman Bruce Rauner had a plan to right the sinking good ship Illinois. Rauner emerged from the pack of GOP primary contenders in the spring of 2014 for 3 reasons. One was his money. He had piles of it, thanks to a long, successful career as a venture capitalist. 2 is the popular belief that successful business people are likely to make successful politicians because they know how to run things. And 3 was that he didn't have much of a public record for his opponents to attack. No awkward votes, no big flip-flops to speak of. He positioned himself as a socially moderate, economically conservative Republican of the sort that's done pretty well in Illinois over the years. Think of Mark Kirk, Jim Thompson, Jim Edgar, and the late Judy Barr Topinka. In the fall, he was up against the accidental governor, Pat Quinn. He's a decent man, he's an honest man, he's an earnest man. He never quite seemed up to the job of governor. Quinn, as most of you remember, was the populist gadfly and Democratic Party outsider who ran for lieutenant governor in 2002, back when it was an independent office in the primary that big-time politicians could not be bothered with. Who were his Democratic opponents in 2002 for lieutenant governor? Anybody? I had to look this up. It was Michael Kelleher, the head of economic development at Illinois State University, and Joyce Washington, an administrator at Advocate Healthcare. The big-time Pauls would have been more interested, I believe, if they had known what a self-destructive sleazebag the Democrats had in Rod Blagojevich at the top of the ticket. A little more than 6 years later, Blagojevich was booted from office after his corruption indictment, and Quinn took over, and he even won re-election in 2010. Now, I liked Pat Quinn. He wasn't quite the shambling saint of legend, nor was he the blob of jello that his opponents claimed that he was. He cut the number of state employees by 4,000. He cut discretionary spending by 10%. He attacked the pension problem with gusto, although not a lot of success. And he understood that we could no more tax our way out of problems than we could cut our way out of them. I voted for Pat Quinn last fall. And I wrote a column explaining why right across from the editorial pages of the Tribune, where they have been beating the drum for him all through the campaign. He pushed through Medicaid and workers' compensation reforms. They contributed to a cumulative budget savings of $5.7 billion during his years in office. He also signed bills legalizing same-sex marriage, medical marijuana, and a bill abolishing the death penalty. No one can think that those bills would have been signed into law if Republican Bill Brady had beaten him in 2010. Now, I was still open to a campaign pitch from a socially moderate Republican that spelled out a better plan for leaner government that still performs vital function in popular services. That pitch never came. Rauner's campaign was little more than a series of free market platitudes and vague promises to, quote, shake up Springfield. He said he'd cut income taxes and freeze property taxes, yet increase spending on education and infrastructure. He said he'd solve the pension crisis by putting new state workers into a 401k-style retirement plan, a shift that would have enormous transition costs if it were legal, and would further dry up the existing funds that are needed to make up the $105 billion that we already have accrued in pension obligations. Pressed repeatedly by reporters to explain how he could possibly accomplish all this without severe cuts in social services, corrections, public safety, and other programs, he fell back on the promise of growth, saying that his experience as a successful businessman would allow him to drive results. Well, guess who fell for this nonsense like love-struck teenagers, ideologues, and big babies? Look, Pat Quinn wasn't a good campaigner, and voters were sick of democratically led dysfunction in Springfield. I certainly understood the desire to shake up the town, and I wasn't surprised when Rauner won a comfortable victory. As of April 21st, last Tuesday, he'd been in office 100 days. So how's he doing? The public is giving him a mixed grade. A poll released last week showed 40% of voters approved of his job performance so far, 36% disapproved. Now, how does this compare? In 2003, Governor Rod Blagojevich was at 58% approval to 16% disapproval after 5 months in office. That's the only analogous poll I could find for him. In April 2009, after about 100 days in office, Pat Quinn was at 61% approval. But by September of that year, he was down to 39%. Well, what's to like about Rauner? He's asking some hard questions that need to be asked about where government's money comes from and where it goes. He's putting a focus on, quote, essential spending. He's taking on the troubling and costly alliance between politicians and public union leaders, and he seems sincerely committed to improving education. What's not to like? Well, he's a hard-headed guy who seems to think that government basically gets in the way of the beneficent functioning of the free market. He may, in fact, care about expanding the middle class and patching holes in the social safety net, but if he does, I'm under the impression he believes that charity and enlightened self-interest of the rich will do the job. Let me back up a little bit. 4 years ago, Illinois, facing a cash crunch, approved an increase of the flat rate state income tax from 3% to 5%. 3% to 5% is a substantial increase. Now, is that a high rate? Is 5% a high rate? 7 other states have flat rates now. 2 of them are higher. Massachusetts at 5.15, North Carolina at 5.75. Utah is at a straight 5. 4 are lower. Colorado 4.6, Michigan 4.25, Indiana 3.3, Pennsylvania 3.1. Our other neighboring states have graduated income tax rates that are forbidden by the Illinois Constitution. They top out at higher than 5. Kentucky and Missouri are at 6. Wisconsin 7.65. Iowa's top income tax rate is 8.98. Now, of course, there are 7 states in the country with no state income tax and 2 others that tax just investment income. So the ideal fair rate is certainly a debatable proposition, debatable question. Anyway, this temporary rate was scheduled to sunset on January 1st of this year, even though that increase hadn't put us back onto firm financial footing as had been hoped. Now, what made anyone think in 2011 that a temporary increase was all that we needed, like just a little bridge loan, given the fundamentals of our economy? Nothing. Most of them, like most of us, thought temporary was just a palliative word to ease the shock and reduce the political fallout at the time, and that, like a previous temporary income tax increase in Illinois, it would be made permanent. Last spring, as the fall gubernatorial race was starting to heat up and members of the General Assembly were worrying about their re-election prospects in the spring, the Democrats in the legislature used a variety of fiscal sleights of hand and hopeful assumptions to avoid extending the income tax increase or cutting popular or necessary programs. One Democrat who voted against this budget, Senator Michael Nolan of Elgin, called it, quote, unprincipled and irresponsible. Governor Pat Quinn signed off under protest. He called it an incomplete budget that does not pay down the bills, but instead postpones the tough decisions. But the presumption was that once the election was over, lawmakers would come to their senses and realize they had to keep the state income tax at 5%. Otherwise, they were looking at what was thought to be a $2 billion shortfall. It turned out to be a roughly $1.6 billion hole for the balance of this fiscal year. And if you go beyond this fiscal year, which ends in June, the next fiscal year begins in July, the budget hole left by this reduction puts things at $6.2 billion. And Rauner offered no plan for filling the $6.2 billion hole. But the smart campaign knows 2 things: be vague and be unreasonably optimistic. I was surprised after he was elected, Rauner didn't try to cut some sort of grand bargain with the lame duck legislature, which they'd vote to keep the higher tax rate while giving Rauner, say, some business-friendly changes to workers' comp, the general overall regulations or to corporate taxes. Compromise. That's what politicians do. Good politicians know how to compromise. Politician is a dirty word to a lot of people. Rauner liked to insist during the campaign he was not a politician. Like, that's a good thing. But politics is the best and only way for a large, multifaceted society to attempt to balance the vast array of often conflicting interests of the members of that society. You get a little something you want, you make a little sacrifice. I get a little something I want, I make a little sacrifice. A wealthy venture capitalist who takes over a business with a plan to make it profitable, or at least more valuable, has neither the patience, inclination, or obligation to engage in these kind of negotiations. Business is not democracy. A governor is not a CEO. Now, the grown-up thing, of course, would have been for the lame duck legislature, then as now controlled by Democrats, to pass the tax rate extension upon which their budget relied. They passed the budget. It was up to them, once they had been reelected or not, to vote to extend that tax increase, at least until the end of this fiscal year for which they'd done the budget. That would have been what they should have done. I'll pause again for howls of derisive laughter. Rauner said he had a plan, though. He said the Democrat leaders were corrupt. Well, then they said, let him eat this crap sandwich that he has ordered. And they didn't do anything. They let the tax rate expire. So after way too much agita this spring, Rauner and the legislators came to a bipartisan deal over this $1.6 billion that involved making cuts that clearly surprised people. It cut about $300 million in Medicaid reimbursement, domestic violence shelters, shelters for homeless youths and young wards of the state, sickle cell clinics, scholarship grants for low-income students, funding for community colleges. Tellingly, of that $1.3 billion that they came up, $1.3 billion of that cut came from a sweep of a bunch of special funds. The state collects funds, fishing licenses and road funds and so on. They collect, the state government is not all just all the money in and you spend it. There's a variety of funds that develop, and some of them develop surpluses. You sweep those surpluses away. And so all they ended up cutting was about, I think it was, let's see, 1.3 billion of that, of the 1.6. So it's only about 300 million, which is not, not that much in terms of when you're talking about a state budget as large as ours. What was really telling to us about that was that Rauner Rauner campaigned on how wasteful all the spending was, but when it came right down to it, he could only find $300 million for 6 months that he could cut. We could get agreements on cutting, and he didn't go around pointing at other programs that he could have cut. He's just saying, well, that's about all he could find. They came to this agreement, and then they were starting to look forward at the next fiscal year. But on Good Friday, when the legislature was out on their spring break, Rauner sprung another $26 million in social service cuts targeting immigration, autism, epilepsy services, burials for the indigent, and so on. Legislature was surprised. I was surprised because $26 million is pocket change when you're talking about a discretionary budget that's north of $31 billion. And it served to step on whatever green shoots of trust and cooperation were poking through the soil in Springfield. Democrats were outraged at these cuts. For the next year, Rauner plans still more and deeper cuts to transportation, higher education, local governments, health, and social services. A week after Easter, he did announce that he was going to keep $100 million in business tax credits because, well, those had been promised and the business community was counting on them. What is his long game? We didn't talk much about it during the general election campaign. It's pretty obvious that Rauner, like a lot of captains of industry and champions of the free market, is strongly of the opinion that unions are a cancer. Their members are compensated more than what they are, quote, worth, and ultimately this deprives the worthy of all to which they are fairly entitled. Now, I disagree with this. Without getting into a long explanation or argument, I'll just say that I think in general, despite its excesses here and there, organized labor has been a salutary influence on American society in the last 100 years. Rauner is promoting what he calls his turnaround agenda, which is foremost a plan to strip unions of their power. One element of it is a desire to empower localities within the state to vote to declare themselves zones in which employees of union shop companies do not have to join the unions as a condition of their employment. He likes to call this idea, quote, right to work. Most of my colleagues in the media have adopted this term without condition and without quote marks around it. In fact, a more apt term would be right to freeload, because those who don't pay their union dues still by law get all the advantages of union membership, all the raises, all the benefits that are collectively bargained for, all the due process and representation when grievances arrive without paying dues. And, by the way, for those who fret that union members may be forced to fund political donations for candidates whom they do not support, the law already allows them to withhold that portion of their dues that goes to political action. So don't be fooled. The push for the right to freeload zones, which Attorney General Lisa Madigan says violates state law and which the U.S. Department of Labor says violates federal law, isn't some stout defense of the freedoms of the working person. It's an attempt to weaken and even destroy unions. Why would you pay dues if you can get the same benefit either way? So that employers can pay lower wages, which will in turn theoretically, in Rauner world, make Illinois a more attractive place to do business. Other elements of this turnaround agenda include repealing the Prevailing Wage Act that requires contractors or subcontractors to pay workers on public works projects what amounts to union wages. This allows, and also he wants to allow local voters to decide issues that can be collectively bargained, and he wants to reduce workers' compensation. Unions argue that a race to the bottom would result, further eroding the middle class and hurting local businesses that depend on local customers. A lot of municipalities don't like other parts of Rauner's plan. One part of it calls for a freeze in local property taxes, along with a significant reduction in the town's share of state income tax revenue, about half. So right now, a portion of your state income taxes just gets kicked right back to your hometowns. And Rauner's plan is to cut that in half and spend that on the state budget. Now you see what happens here. You freeze property taxes so the cities can't raise more money, and then you take away money from them, and they don't have any way to fund some of the services they want to fund. Rauner refers to this as local empowerment. Many working people, many municipal leaders see it as evisceration. A couple of weeks ago, he created an independent political expenditure committee called Illinois Turnaround. He's going to campaign for his agenda, raise money beyond the $20 million he's already raised in private funds to advertise and support office holders who are friendly to his agenda. And all across the state, he's been asking city councils and village boards to pass advisory motions in favor of parts of his plan. The results have been mixed, but so far there's little evidence that Rauner's war on unions has struck a chord beyond his political base. His position is that until and unless the legislature helps him enact his so-called turnaround agenda, more and deeper program cuts are on the way. We're not going to get an increase in the minimum wage, and he's not going to raise any taxes. Because only with his turnaround agenda will we be able to free up the money that we need to fund the services that many people count on. Now, whether this is hard-nosed negotiating or a steely form of hostage-taking is certainly a matter of opinion. Here's what Rauner said recently to the Illinois Chamber of Commerce, quote, "Crisis creates opportunity for change, and we have a crisis. We've got to take advantage of that. A lot of people are saying, Bruce, just balance the budget and worry about other stuff later. We'll talk to you later about reform. No, no, no. If we do only that, they'll never talk about reform. It'll never happen." I was listening to a radio interview with him on the way up here last week, and he said, balancing the budget will be easy, he said. Well, I'll tell you what's never going to happen. And that is the $2.2 billion in savings that Rauner is counting on to balance the budget next year, according to the plan that he has outlined. Even after he's gored Medicaid, human services, mass transit, including Amtrak, local governments, and public universities, among other sacred cows, he is still counting on $2.2 billion in savings for money that he's not going to invest next year in public pension plans. Now, why is he not going to invest that $2.2 billion that the law requires him to invest? Well, we'll be able to bank that $2.2 billion, he's saying, because he plans to reduce the pension benefits of state workers going forward. He's going to move them all from the generous Tier 1 program to the less generous and cheaper Tier 2 program, into which all new hires have been put since 2011. This will immediately reduce our unfunded pension liability. Again, it's about $105 billion. It'll going to reduce that by an amount that will require us to put less every year into the fund as we try to ramp back up to sustainability. Now, on the off chance that the Democratic majorities in the House and Senate defy what's certain to be vehement union opposition and get on board with this plan, the courts have found in the past that diminishing public retirement benefits violates the Pension Protection Clause in the state's Constitution. There is serious belief by me and many people that the Illinois Supreme Court is going to reject Senate Bill 1, which was the 2013 pension reform package that eked out of the General Assembly. I will point out as an aside that there were savings, anticipated savings associated with that bill, and the Democrats in the legislature, whatever their faults are, did not have the nerve to put those savings into their budgets. What does Rauner say to that? He says, quote, "The key is to pass a constitutional amendment to weaken the pension protections," he said to a TV interview the other day. Right, sure. Such an amendment would require approval from 3/5 of the members of each chamber, then 3/5 of the voters, and the nearest election we could do that in would be November 2016. And even if this amendment were to pass, pension benefit reductions would still be susceptible to court challenges under ordinary contract law. They couldn't take effect until fiscal 2017, probably fiscal 2018. In short, these savings may not be as great as advertised. They may not exist at all, and are in any case part of a long-term plan that requires so many things to go Rauner's way that it is more like an idle daydream than an agenda. Where have we heard that before? The irony is that a man who spent all last year campaigning about the Democrats', quote, phony budget plan that was $1.6 billion short is now offering a proposal that's $2.2 billion short, or 37% more phony. So what now? In short, if crisis creates opportunity, we are looking this spring and summer at easily the greatest opportunities for the city and state in decades. Our best hope, our only hope, is that the spirit of courageous compromise will save the day. We'll take a final pause now for howls of derisive laughter. Now, after a short break, we will answer any questions except where shall we go for lunch?
Thank you. It's really good to see Eric here. He was coming way back when I was president, and so I feel I'm not over the hill yet because you look exactly the same. Anyway, I read on the internet that Illinois is like down at the bottom of the list of people that are not happy in their state and are looking to move away. And I wondered if you had any feedback, if you knew why and what we could do about it and how that impacts us, that we're losing population. People are going elsewhere.
I've seen those same reports that you take polls, and I believe that poll or that study was done like by a moving van company, and it was like counting the people who are moving out of the state versus people who are moving into the state. You know, clearly where job opportunities are here and there, you know, shifts around. I think that, and I also think that there have been years, definitely generations of irresponsibility by our lawmakers who have allowed these debts to accumulate. I mean, we didn't spend a whole lot of time on what's going on in Chicago, but I don't know how the Chicago Public Schools are going to get out of their debt. They owe something like close to $700 million this year in the public schools do in pension obligations because they took pension holiday. So when you build this up, suddenly people are looking like, where do I want to live, or do I want to go to a place where the obligations aren't so big? That's when they start looking away. We do have to, and I don't, in terms of criticizing these politicians, I don't want to say, well, we don't have a problem. We need to just pretend that it's not there. But I think we do need to face up to the balanced approach that we're going to need to do that. If I had better answers, maybe I'd run for office.
Thank you. I'm wondering if, and I might not be remembering the program correctly, because my brother's the one that's in urban planning, not me. He explained this to me. I don't know if you're familiar with the TIF programs, which, if I remember correctly, were developed to help make, tax-free havens for business districts so that they could redevelop into themselves. And it sounds like, from what it has been explained to me from, again, a much more informed source, that there are business districts who obviously aren't really as in need as it, that have been using this for years, possibly decades, like Michigan Avenue and such, to basically have lower taxes than they would have had they not registered for this program. Would you know if that might be a big contribution to the deficits, at least in Chicago proper?
I don't think it's a huge contribution to it. What you're talking about is a program where, I mean, just to put it as simply as possible, you take property tax income that the city gets and you segregate it off into funds that are meant for economic development. And the criticism is mostly that what's happening is that these economic development funds are not going to blighted neighborhoods. The TIF programs are made for blighted neighborhoods. Like we need to encourage businesses in in Englewood and some of these other struggling communities. Instead, they're going to LaSalle Street. They're going to places where they're building things. And Mayor Emanuel is constantly being criticized for that. He's constantly trying to justify that. He is saying that he's going to reform the program. He's going to take some money out of those TIF surplus funds and spend them on schools and so on. It's a whole huge issue. But I don't think that it is the main driver of the problems that we're facing. But it's certainly an issue. I'm not calling on people. Someone else has something. So.
What would be alternatives to cutting the budget besides the human services? It seems like all the cuts are in the human services area. And the second part to it is that if there are, then why did Pat Quinn not take advantage of that? Why did they not go in that direction?
Well, this is one of the reasons that I supported Quinn. Is the idea that there's all this free spending on mints for people's pillows in the Springfield Hilton or something is just not true. That Quinn over the years has picked all the low-hanging fruit. And there isn't a lot of state spending that you could point out and say, well, that's just a waste of money. There's always fat in the system. There's always too much. But there aren't a lot of programs. You can't, when people talk about, the government, and that's one of the reasons why I was so hard on Rauner, saying, well, what are you going to cut? Because the government is, the citizens ask for and we need a certain size of government. So what they have to do is, they have to have some reductions. They're having some contract negotiations with the union. They may be able to reduce some pay, but there's not. The pension problem is really the one that's driving this issue, and dealing with that is a really tough problem. But one of the things that I say to people is, like, all these years that we've been underfunding the pension, those funds have not been going to buy vacations for Aaron Schock. They've been going to programs that we have been using. We've been getting a discount, so to speak, over the years. So I guess what I'm saying is there isn't a lot of stuff. And when I talked about how we had this crisis earlier this spring and they got together and said, okay, what are we going to cut? They could only find like $300 million to cut, which is, prorated is about $500 million out of a $31 billion budget. And even those cuts looked pretty bad. So now we're looking at a $6.1 billion hole in the budget. I just don't think you're going to find programs saying, well, we can get rid of that, we can get rid of that. I mean, you're talking about cuts in programs that mean a lot to people. Or you're talking about things like, well, maybe it's time to start thinking about a graduated income tax. It is unconstitutional in Illinois, but that's something that a lot of people are looking at going forward. There was a referendum in November in which voters strongly endorsed the idea of the so-called millionaire's tax. It's going to be time to talk about spreading out sales taxes to services. It's going to be time for Chicagoans to probably pay more in property taxes, and so you have to balance these approaches.
I've convinced myself that the structure of Chicago, with the aldermen basically being administrators, but nominally also the legislature, has it makes it very unlikely that they will ever sort of act as an independent legislature and challenge the mayor on policy or design issues that are probably pretty important. And I'm just curious if you can help me understand how it can work under the current system, both sort of practically and politically, or if we're sort of doomed to the sort of rubber stamp city council that we've kind of come to know and not love.
Well, if you remember 30 years ago, we had a nice, robust disagreement on the city council with council wars. So it can't happen under the current structure. Chicago does not have a strong mayor system, which is one of the ironies of way things go. There are some strong mayor systems and weak mayor systems. Ours is a relatively weak mayor system. I think that it can work. Yeah, sure. We have the block of progressive aldermen grew a little bit this time. It's still a long way from taking over the system, but there's nothing structurally about the way things are. The only structural problem that is I think at issue is the way campaigns are financed. Chuy Garcia was outspent 6-1, something like that. Money does mean a lot in politics. The richest candidate doesn't always win, but usually does. And Mayor Emanuel and his apparatus is able to raise lots of money from all over the country. And then he's able to use a lot of that money. He formed the Chicago Forward PAC to try to fund aldermen that agreed with him. But structurally, on paper, it works. So.
Illinois is one of the few states that doesn't tax any of the retirement pension income. Mm-hmm. Why is that, and what can be done about that?
Well, you're right about that. I think there are only 4 states that don't tax retirement income in state as a matter of state income, and it's, I guess I read this recently, but it's several $billions a year, I think, that they leave on the table for that. Quinn was adamantly opposed to it. I mean, Quinn was no profiling courage about a lot of this stuff either. I mean, I'm not saying that I was on his team necessarily, but it's something that needs to be considered, and I think that you can do that by with some generous exemptions, so that you don't put people into hardship. I mean, there's a lot of people say, well, I'm living paycheck to paycheck, I'm a fixed income, and so on. I think you don't want to put people into hardship, but there are people who are doing well in retirement, who, they don't want to pay more taxes, but nobody wants to pay more taxes, so they should probably be included in that. That would be how I would argue it.
Both in private industry and in government, one of my observations over time is that smaller generally creates greater accountability. The larger, whether it be corporation or government, the larger the entity gets, the more difficult it is to maintain accountability. We point to a lot of the anecdotal things that we run across at state government levels, where things the money is just there, and it's easy in a bigger pot to kind of siphon things off. Do you think there are good opportunities for us to be able to push more government down to a local level in order to be able to shrink the size of the state government? Would that help in creating better accountability where we could maybe be a little bit better forward-looking?
Well, I'm not so sure that obtains in a way, because I think what happens with a lot of these smaller units of government, Illinois has more small units of government than any state, and one of the reform proposals that's always floated around is we have something like 7,000 units of government in Illinois, which is just enormous. And this, mosquito abatement districts and library districts and park districts and so on, that these offices are so obscure that really the accountability isn't there, that voters don't get out and vote, that voters don't respond. And one of the worries about an elected school board in Chicago is that it'll just be taken over by people who have money to go out and gin up support in elections that have extremely low turnouts. So I'm not sold necessarily on that. I'm not sold on the idea that we should shrink the size of the Chicago City Council, even though it would save $10-15 million a year. Whether, of course, that's actually to your point, I think, actually, which is that the larger council, 50 people in city council, means that there's more accountability, that your alderman is there. So I don't know. One of the things that happens in large legislative bodies is that people are allowed not to vote for things that they support and to support things that they don't otherwise do it in order to protect themselves politically, which is not good government. It's not accountable. You don't really know how your legislator stands because he or she may have cast a vote as part of a structured roll call. And you have these big bodies. So, interesting topic, though.
Don't you feel that some of the retirement payouts are exorbitant? I saw a list not too long ago that 43 of the highest retired people in the state of Illinois are former teachers, breaking in over $250,000 a year. And from personal experience, I get together once a month with some people that are former teachers.
I hope they buy.
Pardon?
I hope they buy.
And the one fellow was complaining that this year he and his wife had to sacrifice, and they were only able to go to Florida for 3 months instead of the normal 6 months. Don't you think that we should maybe look a little bit more to the payouts that the pension fund is in fact paying out?
Absolutely.
Be careful how you answer this, Eric, because I'm a retired state employee.
The problem is that, a couple things. First of all, what you're talking about is an artifact of this idea that we had for so long, which is that instead of paying you now, we'll pay you later. Because if we pay you later, we don't have to pay you. Later has to pay you. And so they struck these deals. And what your retired teachers are going to say is, look, I put in we made a deal with the state. We made a deal with our employer. We made a deal with our school board. We said, we'll take a 1% raise if you give us a 3% COLA when we retire. All these deals were set, and we put our money in, and you didn't. The Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund is one of the pension funds in Illinois that is solvent. And the reason that it's solvent is because the law has required that fund to have all these municipalities to put in the money that they have to put in every year, and that's why they're funded, and that's why everybody else isn't funded, because they're not doing that. Now, the problem that you identify of these excessively generous benefits, these are superintendents, there are educators, there are other people who've gotten benefits, who've cut deals that look to us to be outrageous at this point. There's no question about that. The law is pretty clear, the Constitution is very clear that you can't take those away. I think we do need, looking forward, to be sure that those things are realistic. I'm almost certain that there's no way to undo those, that we have to live with those. Rauner even says that he's not, current retirees, Ed, are okay, even by Bruce Rauner's, so not to worry. But yeah, this is, you've identified a problem, and this is, but I think to go and say, well, we're gonna go back on our deal because we were irresponsible. I mean, that's just not. In some way, that violates fundamental fairness, even though the original deal was perhaps too generous. So it's tough.
Going on for a long time. Is there some point where we have to or file for bankruptcy? Definitely.
The question has to do with bankruptcy, and I don't believe a state can file for bankruptcy. There is a measure in Springfield right now, sponsored by Ron Sandak, a West Suburban Republican lawmaker, to allow for municipalities and municipal agencies, such as the Chicago Board of Education, to file for bankruptcy. And that's hotly debated. The problem with that is that, yeah, you do that, but then what happens is, a lot of government relies on borrowing, like all of us. You borrow for a car, you borrow for a house. Government borrows to keep things going. When you are not, and one of the reasons that municipal bonds are a solid investment is that those things always get paid back. And if you start declaring bankruptcy like that, if you pull the rug out, first of all, you discourage future lenders. Your interest rate. I mean, there's a thing in the Sun-Times last weekend that said that something like the Chicago schools, the interest rate they have to pay on their loans now, because they're this right above junk status. It's so huge right now that it's costing them like I think hundreds of millions of dollars a year, something like that. I mean, it's some preposterous figure that the borrowing figure has cost them. So.
I'm a current state employee and approaching retirement age, so I've been following this conversation for the last several years with alarm when they talk about changing the pension benefits for current employees, not just future ones. But before coming to the state 16 years ago, I worked in the private side since a teenager and had quite a bit accumulated in Social Security. But my understanding is that I can't collect Social Security benefits in retirement and the state pension, which seems grossly unfair that everything or almost everything that I put into Social Security doesn't come back at some point. But it raises the issue of, has anybody thought about making either current or, converting people over who are putting money into a state plan? Why don't you just make state employees and municipal employees, teachers, whatever, pay into Social Security like everybody else, put the federal government on the hook for the liability, and then just allow the state and local people to employees to have voluntary additional pension things like you did on the private side?
Well, because the law prevents us from doing that, the federal government is not going to want to assume $105 billion in our pension liabilities. But let me ask you this. You took the microphone away from you, but since you've been working for the state, a couple of things. One is I'm guessing that one of the reasons you went to work for the state, or one of the things that was attractive to you about working for the state, was the pension program. Two, I'm certain, in fact, that you have every paycheck paid into your pension fund. So if they were to come to you tomorrow and go, I know that when we hired you, and as you've been working along, you've been assuming this, and you've been making your plans to retire based on this level of benefit. But we're in a bad way, and we haven't been paying into our pension funds. Shame on us. But we're going to have to cut your pension benefits, and I'm going to put you back into Tier 2. I don't think you would think that was fair. And I don't know what your pension benefit is, but most pension benefits, and you talk about some of these ones the average pension benefit is not that huge in Illinois. It's not like appalling. It's like it is something that is equivalent to a nice retirement investment. But the prospects for what you're talking about, like doing the switcheroo and making the state pay for Social Security, first of all, the state would have to pay their portion for Social Security, which is expensive, and they're still on the hook. I don't think no one says that they're going to take away what you've earned so far. They owe $105 billion. That's not going away. So they can shuffle these things around, and most of the studies that I've seen say that that's going to be more expensive, that the transition costs to putting everyone into a 401k right away and saying, you take your Social Security, would be enormous. And states that have done that have not been happy with it. So.
Thanks for a great talk. I seem to remember that Illinois passed a law or a constitutional amendment that allowed the governor to be recalled in the wake of the Blagojevich arrest and conviction. Yes. And I'm wondering if you foresee a recall Rauner event coming up. And it might be similar to what happened to Scott Walker in Wisconsin.
I don't see that level of anger right now at him, and I'm not really big on recall. I feel like unless it's a criminal act. I mean, these are political decisions he's making. I don't agree with all of them. A lot of people don't, but I feel like we have elections every 4 years to throw the bums out, and we don't do it often enough. And I don't foresee that. So.
Hi, I'm asking this question. I voted for both. I voted for both Quinn and Garcia, and yet I'm an eternal optimist, and I wonder whether you foresee Emanuel and Rauner doing something good for the state of Illinois, some kind of compromise or adjustment. Where I know that Emanuel is a liberal fellow, Rauner is a conservative guy by his nature, but is there some hope that the two of them can come to some kind of compromise that benefits us?
More derisive laughter? No. I don't really see it right now because Emanuel's interest is in filling this enormous budget hole that he has. I mean, they may be able to come to some agreement on things like a casino, but basically, I would say no. I would say I don't see them. Because they both need a lot of money, and Rauner's still opposed to taxes. I don't see it, but I would love to be pleasantly surprised.
Hi, I enjoy reading you as a voice of reason and logic on the progressive side. So I'm only allowed one question, so I can't ask you, where's Elizabeth Warren, and will she only come in if Clinton falters? And I can't ask you, does Obama really want a library on public park property, or is there a better solution? So I'll stick with what we're talking about here, and that is, regardless of who you thought was the better candidate for mayor, it just sort of drove me crazy, the whole piling on in the David versus Goliath. And I saw progressive people that I respected fall all over themselves to support Rahm when they had a progressive person right in front of them. And over you heard that he's just not ready to make the tough decisions, but Rahm is, and so forth. And so I guess I'll try to get this to a question quickly. Guys like Fioretti, who ran for mayor and then supported Rahm, and guys like Joe Moore, who's my alderman, who I really expected to support the progressive.
You did? Really?
Did they, and progressives, did they really believe that Garcia could not do the job, or is it just money, 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 money?
I think there was some legitimate concern about Garcia's experience and his toughness that people expressed. I didn't talk to a lot of people who were very enthusiastic about Emanuel, I have to say. I think a lot of people I know who voted for him said, well, he's a tough son of a gun, let's keep him there. And they didn't think that Garcia was tough enough. So that I did sense a lot of that. I didn't quite feel that because I'm not sure that toughness is what is needed right now. And I thought that Garcia had. The fact that he said he wanted to sit, that people made fun of him for saying, "Oh, I'll sit down with the unions, I'll talk to them." But part of negotiation, a lot of negotiation, is trust. And the fact that he was funded by the Chicago Teachers Union in large part. Well, I don't think he would be a sellout to them. I think that he would have trusted him. There's no trust between Emanuel and the Teachers Union. I think so. I think that contract negotiation is going to be really, really tough. I think he probably could have been a pretty good mayor, but we'll never know.
So just on arithmetic, how does Rahm get anywhere unless he takes on the fire and the police? I mean, he can't just keep cracking on the teachers. So how do you see that ever changing?
I don't. See, you're right. Fire and police, and Rauner exempts them, too, from all of his pension proposals. That all his pension plans of moving people from Tier 1 to Tier 2 and so on, he exempts all first responders from that. Those are huge pension problems that they're facing. They're facing, I think, was it $550 million this year for police and fire pensions, independent of the $700 million they're facing for teacher pensions. I don't know. This is why I think it's going to be such an interesting summer here because the legislature is supposed to adjourn May 31st. I think they're going to be in Springfield all summer dealing with this.
So changing the direction of the conversation a little bit to the point you just made, to an increasingly interesting summer. Spike Lee and Chirac shining a light on an open wound. Is that net positive because it'll spur people who wouldn't otherwise be inclined to action, or is it net negative because it otherwise cast Chicago in an unfavorable light?
It's a good question. Spike Lee is a serious filmmaker. This is not just an exploitation film. We haven't seen the movie. I don't know if the script is ready yet. I think that it could be a positive because I think that it could focus attention and cause a good conversation. Chirac and there's Philadelphia. I mean, there's a lot of nicknames for these cities that come up in rap songs. The problem we have in Chicago is not the nickname. The fact is we have 400 or 500 murders a year here, and our murder rate is not the highest in the country, but it is higher than New York, Los Angeles, other big cities. That's the problem, and if we could address that problem, I don't think we have to worry too much about a movie. So.
We only have time for one more question, and I thought we would do a lottery system. How much am I offered? I think I saw a hand back here.
Sold.
Rauner's notion that his proposals will ultimately raise revenues to the point of bringing the state into the black seemed to me very reminiscent of the now discredited Reagan supply-side economics. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think when you look around the country, you look at, the analogy is like Oklahoma, Kansas, where Sam Brownback came in and decided that he was going to work his miracles by cutting everybody's taxes and stripping things down to the bone, and their state went into a financial tailspin. You look at Wisconsin right now, Governor Walker's approval ratings are very low because all the miracles that he said were going to happen when he attacked unions didn't come about. I don't think that undercutting the middle class. I mean, this gets to this question about unions that I just touched on, which is, I am not a member of a union, but I have certainly read enough and have followed the news enough to believe that organized labor is a overall positive force for our society, and that it has sustained and bolstered a middle class, which is really important to our society, and that the overall weakening of the union movement in this country has been part of what's causing income inequality. It's part of the malaise that many people are under. So I don't think this is Shangri-La at all, and I think that it's you look to more states like Minnesota, where the governor is a liberal Democrat and has gone the other direction, and things are much better there. So yes, I do see echoes there. So thanks everybody for listening to me, and it's fun. Thanks.